Jean Swanson has been an anti-poverty activist here for 30 years. She's been a single parent living in poverty, president of the National...
So what's political will? Political will is when you can fund a convention center when the costs double. Political will is when you can spend billions on Olympic projects while people are sleeping in the street. You know, a more traditional definition, support from politicians who agree on how to solve a problem and have the power and resources to change policy. So what is the history of the government's role in housing? Now, a lot of you are young, which is fantastic, but it means that you probably can't remember when we didn't have very much homelessness in Vancouver. So I saw some gray heads over there, like mine, and we can remember when we didn't have very much homelessness. I used to work at the Downtown Eastside Residents Association in the 70s. We worked on neighborhood improvement, getting the Carnegie opening, stopping over-serving in beer parlors, trying to upgrade the SROs, back then even. But we didn't work on homelessness, because it wasn't a huge problem. So what's changed since then? You know, do we have more addicted people? Do people have more mental illness now? Or what is it? Well, in 1993, the federal government stopped funding new social housing. That was huge. And then the provinces followed suit. In 1996, how many of you have heard of the Canada Assistance Plan? The Canada Assistance Plan is huge, and most people, you guys are an extremely intelligent lot, obviously, because some of you have heard of it, but most people haven't heard of it. It was a law that governed how the federal government gave money to the provinces for welfare. And in 1996, it was abolished. It said that if the provinces were to get money from the feds for welfare, then provincial welfare programs had to provide enough welfare so that people could meet their basic requirements, and it had to provide welfare to people in need, all people in need. The cap was abolished, government started slashing welfare, and they stopped providing welfare to people in need. Okay, there are some other things. Another thing that's happened over the years is minimum wage. Used to be, 1975, it was 122% of the poverty line in BC, now it's 82%. So wages have dropped enormously in the last 25 years or so. The purchasing power of welfare. If welfare for a single person had the same purchasing power today as it had in 1980, it would be $822 a month. Instead it's $610. So that's kind of the history of the role of government in housing. You can't, if you're a very poor person, you can't rent unless you have money, and if you're on welfare and the rates are so low, $375 is what you get for housing. You can't rent anything for that. So why is political will a sticking point? I think right now everybody knows what needs to be done. There's a city report that says what needs to be done. There's the GBRD report. There's the inner-city inclusivity housing report, and they all say the same thing. They say we need thousands of units of new housing need to be built. They say we need to end the barriers to getting on welfare. That was the biggest barrier cited in the city's homeless action plan. The people in need cannot get on welfare because of the rules that were passed by the government in 2002. And we need increased welfare rates so people will have enough money, people who are poor will have enough money to get off the street and rent something. So when I looked in this paper about the definition of political will, there was a couple of other things that were interesting. One is, it said, political actors have reasons to mislead. And the other, it said, well, statements from elites don't necessarily express their real opinion, which is what we kind of face when we deal with spin a lot. And I thought that was pretty interesting because right now our governments know, they know, in spite of what Matthew talked about, that they have enough resources to solve the housing problem. Yeah. Even if a housing unit for a single person costs $200,000 in Vancouver, Our provincial government had a surplus of $4.1 billion last year. The feds had enough surplus in the first quarter of this year, $6.4 billion, that they could have built with cash every single one of the 3,200 units that were recommended by the inner city inclusivity housing table to meet the Olympic commitments, with 1/10 of the federal surplus for the first quarter of this year. Resources are not the problem. Anyway, our governments know this. They know that people in general don't like homelessness. They know that people who are homeless suffer a lot and die early. They also know that it costs them more to look after people who are homeless than it does to build homes. And they know that voters want action. So they know all this and they want to be seen to be doing something. So you might have noticed last March or April, the province announced it was buying 10 hotels. That's good. Then a couple weeks ago they announced they were giving out the contract to run the hotels. And more announcement of the same old hotels. I mean, it's good they bought the hotels, but they don't provide new housing. They're full of residents. Then the province announced that it was restarting. It didn't announce them in exactly this way, but it announced that it was restarting a couple of projects that it canceled in 2001. Monty dug this up. And now Sullivan, our mayor, has a list of allegedly 2,200 units that are in the pipe. But when you look at that list, it's not really 2,200 units. Some of them are assisted living units for seniors, Beulah Gardens and Icelandic residents. Some are shelters, like Union Gospel Mission. Some are new announcements, like the 10 hotels. Some are projects that they canceled. Sullivan includes the Olympic Village housing as housing, social housing, when poor people aren't going to be able to afford to live there, except for maybe 25 of them. So when I do the math on his list, I get 1,346 units, not 2,212. And then we have this 600 units that the province wants to finish by the summer of 2010. And the city is saying that the funding for it is assumed. This is a very strange way of doing business. I've never heard of it before in 30 years. But what it means is the funding is very precarious. Unless we put a lot of pressure on them, this funding won't be used for housing. And the other problem is that of these six sites, and maybe 12 more after, the units aren't adequate. A lot of them are 200 square feet. They've made a separate standard for poor people. It used to be 400 square feet. And it means that the people who live in these units are likely not to stay there and likely not to become community members. So how can we generate the political will to solve the housing crisis? This is, I think, the big question that we need to deal with at your tables. We need a long-term national and provincial housing strategy to ensure that funds are available for building the housing, and we also need to change welfare so people in need can get it, and so the rates are adequate. And we need wages that are high enough to afford rent, like this minimum wage of $10 an hour minimum is what we should have. So, yeah, or more. That's the only criticism I've heard from calling for a minimum wage of $10 is that it's too low. So here are some specific questions for you. How do we expose the spin and reveal what's really happening? How do we help people understand policies that cause homelessness so they can work to change those policies? And how do we get people to care and to translate that caring into political action that politicians notice? And some of the answers to that are over on that table where we've got some cards from Raise the Rates that you can sign calling for higher welfare rates. And of course, as Monty said, you can all come to City Council on December 12th and say we want even more housing and yes, build it in my neighborhood.